at least in part, originated already in the circles of Judaism, which for some time prior to the beginning of the Christian era were exposed to religious and philosophical currents of a diverse nature in the Middle East, primarily coming from Greece. People who were conversant with Plato, people who were conversant with some of the Egyptian mysteries, the higher teachings of Assyro-Babylonian culture and so forth. And these people, in Judaism, they usually refer to them as minim, which means heretics. And there were various levels of heretics, as they always are. You know, the Samaritans, for instance, were one group at the time who didn't want to worship in the temple. The Essenes, whose scriptures, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have become acquainted with, were another. And many of these people felt that there was something wrong, not just with, the commandments and all the minute, picky interpretation of Jewish law about diet and about circumcision and this, that, and the other thing, but who were critical of the Old Testament deity itself, and who said that this does not appear to be a very respectable and commendable entity. In fact, I would hazard a guess, the Old Testament God became more and more of an embarrassment to the learned and cultured Jews of the Hellenistic era, and remained as such for a good many members of that Jewish heresy that ultimately came to be called Christianity. Because that's what it is, and that's what it was. And so a serious problem arose. Something seems to be wrong with this God, you know. To say the least, is a person of a bad character. If any good Jew or good Christian, if there is still one of them left somewhere, you know, would behave the way that God behaves in the Old Testament, well, to say the least, he would be excommunicated and more likely would be turned over to the police. So this does not seem to be a good situation. That is how a lot of people felt, and then they were seeking ways of explaining this situation and of perhaps gaining a vision where they wouldn't have to cope with these terrible contradictions. Now, to this day, Jewish theology holds that God has, so to say, two sides. I mean, I don't mean physically, but two tendencies. There are different ways of translating that word, yesirim, two proclivities, two tendencies. And what are they? Good and bad. So God has a good side, God has a bad side. The nice things that happen to us come from his good side. The nasty things that happen come from his bad side. Now, as Carl Jung, our illustrious modern Gnostic, was one to point out, you know, this kind of reasoning seems to be rooted in, or at least closely related to, the way children regard their parents. Now, I have luckily, and not without some serious work, evaded parenthood in this lifetime. This evasion is actually one of my principal accomplishments as I look back upon my life. So, you know, I can't speak for myself in that regard, but like we all did, I had parents, and I certainly have observed many others. And, you know, since no human is perfect, obviously the children will see their parents, 1 minute or one day they're really kindly and nice and good to them and bring them good chocolates and hopefully marzipan, which is superior to chocolate. And my parents certainly did. And then, then the other day they are capricious. They are annoyed with the child. They are no longer nice to the child. In fact, they may ignore, which is probably worse than punish, the child and things of that sort. And so the child says, well, mommy and daddy have a good side and they have a bad side. And since I am their child, I just have to live with both of them. I hope that somehow things will come even in the long run. So that to a large extent it seems to be a projection of the way that children regard their parents, and this projection has, let's say, entered the image of the Father in heaven, of the deity. Well, that may be a way of trying to cope with that situation, but it certainly wasn't enough for a lot of people. And Christopher Hitchens and the other writers at the present time, Hitchens has several entries about Gnosticism in his book and others, but still they pay minimal attention to the undeniable historical fact that there were definitely some very powerful alternatives to the established Judeo-Christian God concept and God image. And so let's go a little bit further, and let's say then along came these people, Jewish heretics and ultimately Christians also, who said, well, how might it be if this deity that appears in the Old Testament is not really the ultimate deity? That there may be something beyond this deity. Of course, we find the protestations of the Old Testament God that I am the only God and there are no other gods beyond me and all that sort of thing, and also the fierce condemnation of all other deities of other people around, In fact, very few people talk about that, but if you want a real reason, historically, why, let's say, Judaism and subsequently Christianity were so misogynistic, had such a poor relationship to the feminine, it was because of the attitude of their God toward the other deities around, a good many of whom, not all, but a good many of whom were goddesses, And the goddesses were all, I think that there is maybe some relationship to the rap singers and people like that, because all the deities were hoes, all the female deities, that's where it really all originates. It's an ethnic and a national hatred and defensiveness rather than anything else. Now, here, of course, now we have to enter a little bit another realm, which may be a little more difficult conceptually to deal with or to accept than what I had so far. And that is this, that among these people, originally Jews, but then also others afterwards, there were those who had capacities, powers, whatever you want to call it, of prophetic and transcendental insight. After all, Judaism is the prime prophetic religion. It was full of prophets. And while, say, Zoroastrianism had only one prophet, and then Islam had only one prophet, the seal of, although Muhammad referred to many earlier prophets, even Jesus is a prophet, but this is a prophetic tradition. And in that prophetic tradition there were, well, let's say prophetic people who did not necessarily follow the pre-established pattern of thus saith the Lord, referring to this Old Testament deity, but who, let's say, communed with, so they felt, with transcendental powers, and who saw and conversed with angels. There was a big thing among the Essenes, for instance. These people had a whole elaborate system of angel magic, and they probably moved to the shore of the Dead Sea specifically because it was believed that it was a good place to do magic. Angel magic particularly. So these people communed with angels, they engaged in celestial flights, that's probably where the Kabbalah came from the Merkava, from riding on the chariot and so forth, and who, let's say, felt, well, we are able, if we sufficiently alter our consciousness, to carry on investigations of our own. And then they would get together and compare notes. Well, what did you find? What